go on to the next section where we talk about social differences and how Mahabharata might represent these social differences. So let's look at the framework of caste and where would everyone following the caste norms set down by the Brahmins. So you had to have the right occupation, which was determined by birth. Now there were four varnas, which were pointed out. The Brahmins, whose ideal or the right occupation was to be priests and teachers, to study the Vedas, perform sacrifices, and accept gifts. Kshatriyas, the second caste, they were supposed to fight wars, protect people, perform sacrifices and get them performed, and give gifts and study the Vedas. The Vaishyas, or the third caste, they studied the Vedas, they got sacrifices performed, they made gifts, they engaged in agriculture, pastoralism, and trade. So they were kind of the wealth producers of society. And then we come to the Shudras, whose job was to serve the higher three Varnas. So the Purusha Sukta hymn also talks about this, where they talk about the divine origin. So from the primeval man or the Purusha, from different body parts, each of these castes emerge. So the Brahmins, appear from the head or the mouth in different versions. The Kshatriyas emerge from the arms and the shoulders. The Vaishyas come from the thighs, and the Shudras actually from the feet of this primeval being, right? So which is why the Shudras are always the bottom of society and are only meant to serve the higher castes. What were the strategies used by the Brahmins to make sure the larger society was following the norms set down by them? One, that assert that the Varna was of divine origin. So put this in the Rig Veda, the Purusha Sukta hymn, and say, how actually it comes from, divinely ordained. So you really can't change it or question it. And then they went on to advise the kings to ensure that these norms are followed within their kingdoms. That it's your duty as representative of Vishnu on earth. It is your religious duty to make sure that all caste norms are followed within your kingdom. And then also persuade people that their status was actually determined by birth, which was due to the karma in previous life. So if you haven't performed good karma or the right karma according to your caste in your previous birth, you're born in a lower caste, right? So if in this birth you perform your tasks as per caste injunctions, you have a better chance of being born into a higher varna. So that was enough to scare people, largely to follow caste norms. But then it seems that these caste norms were not always followed. So one example is that there were non-Kshatriya kings. Mauryas have been considered to be of low origin. The Shungas and Kanvas were Brahmins. Shakas were outsiders, or the term Mlechas being used to refer to them. Then we have, if you go back to the Satvahana example, again we have Gautami Puta Siri Satkani, who claimed to be a unique Brahman and a destroyer of the pride of Kshatriyas. Here, Kshatriya is supposed to be king. He also claims that he had ensured that there were no, intercaste marriages among the four Varnas. But at the same time, he is entering into the marriage alliance with the kin of Rudradaman, who was a Shaka or a Mlech, an outsider. So it seems that the Satvahanas were claiming something, but perhaps doing something else altogether, right? So that also goes on to show that Brahmanical norms were not always followed. Now, this brings us to the concept of jati and social mobility. So, what is jati? Jati is also largely based on birth. You could call it subcaste in layperson's terms. It is largely occupational in nature, and there is no limit on the number of jatis. Right? Each jati would come under one varna order, that is either a Brahman or a Kshatriya or Vaishya or Shudra. But there is no limit to the number of jatis, right? So within one caste, you can have innumerable jatis. So you would have Suvarnakar, like goldsmiths or telis, or those who are oil pressers. You could have jatis of weavers, right? And different occupational groups perhaps came to have different jatis. And what is interesting about jati is that it did allow for some social mobility, that members could actually change their profession. So we have some, rare inscriptions, issued by certain jatis where they also claim that they are largely, they're perhaps weavers, but among them, there are people who write or there are people who go to war. Yes. So jati did allow for some social mobility. Let's look at, the four varnas and how that might lead to some integration. Some communities outside the varnas were seen as sympathetic elements. For example, Hidimba is married to Bhim, and Ghatotkach is born of that marriage, and Ghatotkach plays a very, very key role in the war of Mahabharata. He actually sacrifices his life to ensure that his father's family wins. Others are seen as inimical to the Varna order. For example, Eklavya, he challenges the Varna order by training to be like a Kshatriya. So he has to be put in line and his thumb has to be taken away, as punishment for transgressing caste norms. And then we look at subordination and conflict. In subordination, of course, we look at the example of untouchability here, which are based on notions of purity and pollution. I'm sorry, I will change that when I share the link to the presentation. So it's based on norms of pollution and purity. So those who perform pure occupations like performing rituals and studying and teaching of the Vedas, these are considered to be pure occupations, right? So they are the upper caste people. Yet there are others who are supposed to perform the polluted jobs, for example, removing and skinning dead animals, or cleaning up, uh, uh, doing menial jobs. These were considered as polluting, right? So the at the bottom of the untouchable society lived the Chandals, who had to follow very strict norms. Their touch was seen as polluting. Sometimes, even in some text, even seeing them was considered polluting. They were supposed to live outside of the village or the city. They could only use discarded utensils. They couldn't go to the market and buy new ones. So when people threw away their utensils, that's what they picked up and they took home. They were to wear the clothes of the dead, since the Chandalas were the ones who manned the crematoriums of where people were cremated. They removed the clothes of the dead bodies and they could only wear those. And they were only allowed ornaments of iron, no other metal. They could not freely walk about villages and cities at night. They had to dispose of the bodies of those who had no relatives and often served as executioners. So we have the Chinese Buddhist monk Fa Hian and later Yuan Sang, who observed that the untouchables performed roles of executioners and scavengers, and they had to sound a clapper in the street so that people could avoid seeing them. But this status was not always accepted. So some of the Buddhist or Pali and Prakrit texts do talk about some Chandalas or some untouchables, sort of turning the tables on the three upper castes. Now, how did you access resources? There were two major ways of accessing resources or being denied resources. One was gender. Your gender determined, so whether you're a man or a woman, determined what kind and how much of resources you could control. And the other was varna. So let's look at gendered access to property. Now, when we looked at property inheritance rules in the Dharma Shastras and Dharma Sutras, uh, the ancestral property was to be shared equally among sons with a special share for the eldest. So when you had kings, the throne would obviously go to the eldest son. Now for women, they were only allowed to retain stridhan and other gifts that she would receive at the time of marriage or through her life, if somebody gave her gifts. No, they were not supposed to own any land. And Manusmriti also warns women against the hoarding of stridhan. So they said that if the family needs it, you must give your Sridhan. You should not hold it against your husband's wishes. And Prabhavati Gupta was, of course, an exception to all of this, obviously, because we have mentioned time and time again that she was an exceptional woman. Now, Varna also determined access to property. Like the first three Varnas were usually depicted as wealthy or at least middle class. But poor Brahmins are mentioned too. So if you look at Sudama, for example, Sudama is supposed to be extremely poor. And he comes to Krishna, who's a low caste, not an untouchable though, but he is a low caste person. Yet, Sudama, being a Brahman, actually goes to seek alms from Krishna. Shudras have been represented largely as poor, but we do have some rare depictions of wealth as well. Also, if you look at the Mauryas, they were most likely Shudras or at least of very humble origins, yet they come into great wealth when they established the empire of Magad for themselves. Now, there is an alternate scenario that we also encounter, which is about sharing wealth. So, sharing of wealth and generosity is praised in many texts. Miserliness is criticized. Especially when we look at Sangam texts, we find a large number of compositions where bards are praising the generosity of chiefs of the Tamil territory, of the Tamilakam. If you look at the previous chapter, there is reference to how, when the bards went and showed their, ribs due to hunger and starvation, the chief would actually, go and raid nearby communities, bring back wealth from there, and share that wealth with the bards. Yeah, so you do have references to sharing of wealth as well. How